My name is Adam, and I'm 13 years old. It's weird how one day you can be arguing with your brother about the last piece of pie, and the next, you're trapped in a storm shelter with your family, feeling like the walls are closing in on you. It started as a normal day. The sun was out, the birds were chirping, and my older brother Sam and I were playing video games in the living room. Mom was in the kitchen, her humming blending with the sound of sizzling bacon, while Dad was outside, probably tinkering with the lawnmower again. Everything felt perfectly ordinary until the skies started to darken, and the wind picked up like something out of a nightmare. "Adam, Sam, get your butts down here!" Dad's voice boomed from the backyard, urgent and tense. We rushed to the window and saw the sky, a dark, churning mass of clouds that looked like they were about to swallow the world. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Mom burst into the room, her face pale. "We need to get to the storm shelter, now!" The four of us scrambled out the back door, the wind howling around us, carrying leaves and debris. The old storm shelter loomed ahead, a squat, concrete bunker partially hidden by overgrown bushes. I'd always hated that place, the way it seemed to swallow the light and exhale darkness. Dad wrenched the heavy door open, and we hurried inside. It was a small, cramped space with concrete walls that smelled of damp and mildew. There were a few old wooden benches and shelves stocked with dusty jars and cans. A single flickering bulb cast eerie shadows, making the place feel even smaller. Dad slammed the door shut and bolted it, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The air inside was thick and stale. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, mixing with the sound of the storm raging outside. Mom and Dad tried to reassure us, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Sam was pretending to be brave, but I could tell he was scared too. We all were. The shelter seemed to shrink around us, the walls pressing in, the ceiling lowering. I tried to focus on anything but the suffocating tightness. There was an old radio on one of the shelves, and Dad turned it on, hoping to catch some news about the storm. Static crackled through the tiny speaker before a voice cut in, strained and urgent. "This is an emergency broadcast. Residents of Smith, Cherokee, and Anderson counties, take shelter immediately. Lock all windows, bar the doors. Do not leave the structure you are inside of, and do not let anything in. I repeat, do not let anything in." A chill ran down my spine. The voice on the radio was so desperate, so certain. I glanced at Dad, who was staring at the radio. "What's happening, Dad?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the static. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the radio. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes hard. "We're going to be fine, Adam. We just need to stay calm and follow the instructions." I nodded, but I didn't believe him. The shelter felt like a tomb, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was out there, just waiting for us to let our guard down. The storm roared outside, but inside, it was eerily quiet. The silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the dark corners. We huddled together on the benches, the air growing colder, the damp seeping into our clothes. Time seemed to stretch, each minute dragging on, the storm's fury unrelenting. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the claustrophobic space, the fear gnawing at my insides. The radio crackled again, and the same voice repeated the warning. "Do not let anything in." The words echoed in my head, a mantra of dread. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the storm. Something else was coming. Something that wanted in. As the hours dragged by, the shelter grew colder, darker, more suffocating. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. Mom and Dad tried to keep us calm, but their fear was palpable. Sam and I stayed close, our usual sibling rivalry forgotten in the face of whatever nightmare was unfolding outside. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew one thing for sure. We were trapped. And the walls of the shelter were closing in, pressing down, leaving us with nowhere to run. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. At first, I couldn't figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. The pounding on the door, frantic and desperate, each thud reverberating through the small space like a drumbeat. Bam, bam, bam. Someone was out there, in the storm, banging on the door with a force that seemed almost inhuman. The voice that accompanied the pounding was muffled but insistent, a woman's voice, calling out, "Karen! Karen! Let me in!" Mom's name. Mom stirred beside me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. That's my sister," she gasped. "It's Linda." Dad was already on his feet, his face a mask of worry. "Are you sure?" he asked. But his question was drowned out by another series of bangs, even louder than before. "Karen, it's me, Linda. Please, let me in." Mom jumped up, her panic evident. "We have to let her in, John. That's my sister out there." Dad grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "The broadcast said not to let anyone in. We can't take any chances." "She'll die out there." Mom's voice was a mixture of desperation and determination. She shook off Dad's grip and moved toward the door. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. The storm outside had grown even more intense, the wind howling like a living thing, the rain lashing against the shelter. The pounding on the door seemed amplified, each blow shaking the entire structure. "Mom, wait!" Sam shouted, but she was already unbolting the door, her hands trembling. "Karen, please!" Linda's voice was louder now, clearer, and filled with terror. Mom wrenched the door open, and the storm roared in, a blast of cold, wet fury that made us all stagger back. In the doorway stood Linda, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through, her eyes were wild with fear. "Linda!" Mom cried, reaching out to pull her sister inside. But Linda held up a hand, stopping her. "No, Karen, I can't stay. They're coming. You have to run, now." "What? Who's coming?" Mom's voice was shrill with panic. Linda shook her head, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "There's no time to explain. Just go! Get out of here!" Dad moved to close the door, but Mom was already stepping outside into the maelstrom. "Karen, no!" he shouted, but she didn't stop. I watched, frozen with fear as Mom and Linda disappeared into the storm, the wind and rain swallowing them up. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the roar of the storm but leaving us in a suffocating silence. "Dad, we have to go after them," Sam said, his voice shaking. "No," Dad said, his voice grim. "We stay here. It's not safe out there." "But Mom," I started, but Dad cut me off. "She'll be back. She has to come back." He didn't sound convinced. We huddled together, the shelter feeling even smaller and more oppressive without Mom. The storm raged on outside, the sound of the wind and rain almost deafening. Every minute felt like an eternity. Why did she leave? What's out there? My mind raced with questions, none of which had answers. The fear gnawed at me, a constant gnawing presence that wouldn't let go. Hours passed. Or maybe it was just minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that tiny, dark space. We waited, the air thick with tension and dread, for any sign of Mom or Linda. But all we heard was the relentless storm, and all we felt was the growing certainty that something terrible was out there, something that wanted in. And with every passing moment, the walls seemed to close in tighter. We waited for what felt like an eternity. The storm still raged outside, but all I could think about was Mom and Linda out there, somewhere in the chaos. Then, just as the hopelessness began to sink in, we heard it. A knock at the door. Not frantic this time, but measured, deliberate. "John, it's me. Let me in," came Mom's voice, clear and calm. Dad rushed to the door, fumbling with the bolts. "Karen, thank God!" He threw the door open, and there she was, soaked to the bone but seemingly unharmed. Relief washed over me as she stepped inside. "Mom!" Sam and I exclaimed together, rushing to her. "Shh," she whispered, closing the door behind her and bolting it securely. "We have to stay quiet." Dad moved to embrace her, but she stepped back, her eyes glinting strangely in the dim light. "Mom?" Sam asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's okay, boys," she said, her tone soothing. "Everything's going to be fine now." Dad was already rebolting the door, his relief evident. "What happened out there? Where's Linda?" She didn't make it, Mom replied, her voice flat. But we're safe now. There was a strange edge to her words, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Before I could dwell on it, the unthinkable happened. With a sudden, terrifying speed, Mom lunged at Sam, her hands tearing into him with a strength I didn't know she possessed. His screams filled the shelter, a sound so raw and primal it seemed to shake the very walls. The noises that followed were horrific, tearing, crunching, a wet, sickening sound that made my stomach churn. "Karen, stop!" Dad shouted, rushing toward her. But it was too late. In moments, it was over. Sam lay on the floor, motionless, a pool of blood spreading around him. "Mom, what are you doing?" I cried, backing away, my voice trembling with terror. She turned to face us, her eyes now dark, empty voids. "We have to stay safe," she repeated, her voice devoid of emotion. Dad grabbed me, pushing me behind him. "Run, Adam! Hide!" I stumbled back, finding a small, dark corner behind some shelves. I crouched down, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. From my hiding place, I could see the horrifying scene unfold. Dad tried to reason with her, his voice desperate, pleading. "Karen, this isn't you. Fight it." With a feral growl, she leaped at him, and the sounds started again. This time, the noises were even worse, the sickening crunch of bones, the wet tearing of flesh, the gurgling of blood. I clamped my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. Tears streamed down my face as I rocked back and forth, trying to convince myself this was just a nightmare. When the sounds finally stopped, the shelter was eerily silent except for the occasional drip of blood from the ceiling. I peeked out from my hiding place, my heart pounding in my chest. The floor was a mess of crimson, and Dad lay still, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Mom stood in the center of the shelter, her chest heaving, blood dripping from her fingers. I held my breath, hoping she wouldn't see me. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room, and for a moment, I thought she might leave. But then her eyes locked onto mine, and a smile spread across her blood-stained lips. "We have to stay safe, Adam," she said, her voice soft, almost loving. I continued to write, desperate to document what was happening, even if no one would ever read it. Mom is not herself. She killed Sam and Dad. I don't know what to do. Please, if anyone finds this...
This is Officer Daniels, reporting from the storm shelter in the outskirts of Anderson County.
The voice crackled over the radio.
We've just arrived at the location following the severe weather event that swept through the area.
There was a brief pause, the sound of shuffling papers and heavy breathing audible through the static.
The shelter door was found ajar, swinging in the wind. There are clear signs of a struggle inside. The floor is covered in blood. Too much to belong to a single person. The scene is... it's a nightmare in here.
Another pause, longer this time. The officer's voice wavered as he continued.
We discovered a journal amid the chaos. It appears to belong to a young boy named Adam. The last entry is disturbing, suggesting some kind of attack from within the family. There's mention of the mother, Karen, acting violently, killing her own children and husband.
The radio fell silent, leaving only the faint hum of static and the echo of unanswered questions hanging in the air.